Okay, well, we make a start. Welcome to this meeting of the Policy and Resources Committee. So the usual rules, put yourself on mute when you're not speaking and indicate in the chat function if you want to speak. So item 1 is apologies, substitutions and declarations of interest. Sharon?
Convener, apologies from Councillor with the Provost substituting, and also from Councillor McCormick with Councillor Dorian substituting. So,
okay, welcome to the Welcome to the Provost. Welcome to the Provost and Councillor Dorian. Does anybody want to make any declarations?
No.
No? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to item 2 is the COVID-19 coronavirus scrutiny report. So I'm going to ask Martin to introduce the report, and then the intention would be to go through each of the main sections of the report to take any questions or comments. I have had some prior notification of some questions from Councillor Robertson, so I can bring her in at the appropriate juncture as well. If anybody wants to ask a question in any of the sections, please indicate in the chat. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. Just go very quickly through some of the updates to this. We obviously left the circulation of this report to the last minute, but even doing that in this kind of environment we're in leaves quite a number of things that require a verbal update. So if I could just quickly go through the report section by section. So starting off with 4.1, the background, the rate per 100k, members are probably interested to know that the rate seems to have settled over the last few days at around about 140 cases per 100,000. So having been going steadily down for quite a period, it seems to have plateaued. Now, what we need to see is if this is going to be a long-term trend or if it's just a temporary blip. However, what is interesting is it appears to be the exact same pattern for all the other councils in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, where they have ceased going down temporarily, apart from Glasgow, which, although it remains the highest, has still got a downward trend. So we're not clear on what that really means yet, but we'll obviously try and keep members appraised through the weekly data update. Section 6, there's nothing really to update on Section 6, other than I think it's probably worth highlighting the HSE visit referenced in Section 6.6, which was quite satisfactory. I think they were generally satisfied with what they found when they inspected the municipal buildings. Section 7, I've got no specific update on. Section 8, vaccinations. Obviously, members are aware that we started vaccinating, or the NHS started vaccinating in Greenock Town Hall yesterday. As of some discussions yesterday, we will now be opening Port Glasgow Town Hall for vaccinations starting next Monday. Now, we kind of always had Port Glasgow Town Hall up our sleeves as the next vaccination centre, but it's being brought on faster through a kind of a demand to increase the rate of vaccination nationally. So that will be with effect from next Monday. So we're currently working on getting the Port Glasgow Town Hall set up for that. Section 9 is about testing. We had further meetings yesterday with the Scottish Government and Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board, and we will have a proposal for some community testing in Inverclyde fairly soon. This is to look at asymptomatic testing as opposed to the symptomatic testing, which we're fairly well covered for with combination of the Partly mobile testing unit and the walk-in centre in Crawfordsburn. Section 10, we are also, in terms of humanitarian assistance, we're also now looking at how we can address any outstanding transport needs for people requiring transport to vaccination centres, although there needs to be largely a dependence on people making their own way wherever possible to those centres. On Section 11 regulation, we can report that as of last week, there's an agreement with the Health and Safety Executive that environmental health will carry out COVID inspections and give COVID advice in all businesses, including those covered by the Health and Safety Executive for Health and Safety at Work enforcement. Previously, what we were doing was informing them, and they were coming back to us on a case-by-case basis. There's now we can now short-circuit that slightly, that if we get any issues in any workplaces, that we can now get involved in them. And Section 12, no update on Section 12, but members will note that the appendix detailing the proposals for future events and the point in time where we actually have to make decisions as to whether they go ahead in their current mode or whether they need to be adapted. Happy to take any questions, and obviously other officers will be able to address some of the individual points in the section by section.
Okay, thank you for those updates, Martin, for your report. So I'm going to progress through the report section by section, taking any questions. So I know Councillor Wilson has indicated a question. Maybe if you could indicate what section, Councillor Wilson, the report's on, or whether it's a general question. I'll proceed through section by section. So section 4, I've got a question from Elizabeth, so bring Elizabeth in first.
Thanks, Camille. It's really just a question about sort of forward planning, sort of sustainability planning, really. I think we know the experience that we've had is that we've gone into lockdown a couple of times, we've restricted things a couple of times, things get better, then we come out of lockdown and things get a bit worse again. And I'm just wondering, it's not necessarily, it's certainly not in our gift to make all the decisions about this either, I'm fully aware of that, but it's not sustainable to just kind of keep bouncing into lockdown, out of lockdown, things get worse, go back into lockdown. And are there chats at a sort of national level about taking a different and more sustainable approach to how we do move forward and not have a bounce about going forward, really?
Well, I'm thinking about who's going to answer that question, Martin. You could kick off on it.
I'll try and make a start, convener. Obviously, we're not entirely privy to everything that's being discussed at a national level. I think, though, what we can probably say with some certainty is that I think there's, to a degree, a dependence or a hope that the vaccination programme will actually lead to a position where actually you don't have to bounce around quite so much. Certainly from the point of view of serious ill health and pressure on the NHS and fatalities, that if the vast majority of more susceptible people have been vaccinated, that becomes less of a concern. Now, there obviously are still concerns for younger people who can be badly affected, even though it's less likely, but they can get the likes of long COVID, etc., and these can be quite serious complaints. But I think that the hope is that the vaccination, a level of vaccination, will reduce transmission and will also reduce some of the side effects of increased transmission.
I mean, what I would say, having just listened to the First Minister update Parliament, is that the Scottish Government certainly is going to be introducing fairly strict quarantine for all travellers into Scotland from all destinations. That's the details of that are still to be reported. So clearly, part of the medium-longer term strategy is to try and stop the virus reseeding into Scotland as we progress to get the rate of the virus down. She'd also indicated that potentially at the start of March we might see some easing of the current restrictions, but there's a lot of unknowns, and particularly the impact of the new variants are there. So I suspect it is a combination of drive down community transmission, obviously complete the vaccination programme, and protect our borders as best we can. But all indications are we're going to be living with this virus for the foreseeable future. And it's not beyond the possibilities that we'll see lockdowns at different stages in the future as well. Okay, right. You're making life a bit difficult for me because some of you are saying you want to ask general questions and some want to ask specific questions. So I'll try and do the best I can to get my way through this. So I'll bring in Jim first because he's asked a specific question on this section. Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and I'm sure you'll do the best. I know you're used to chairing a meeting. I suppose my question is really on 4.1, where we had seen up to 580, as you said, Martin, and now we seem to have plateaued a bit. And my question is really about track and trace. So when we've plateaued, do we know why we're not continuing to downward? Is the track and trace telling us where? I know we could go into neighbourhoods and we could see that in the daily update, what neighbourhoods that they're coming from. But from your point of view, from the track and trace, is the track and trace giving us any information of why we're plateaued and where the cases are coming from? If that makes sense.
Martin?
So we kind of have regular meetings with Test Protect to look at this, and regular meetings on where there appear to be small outbreaks. So anything that's not a kind of individual case or a household outbreak. However, I'd have to report that there hasn't been a great deal in terms of those in Inverclyde over the last couple of weeks. So most of the cases have been sporadic, don't appear to have been linked to a workplace or anything like that. So we're covering that on a regular basis. I know that there is certainly plenty of capacity in Test and Protect, because even when we were at, I think, the worst, just at the very beginning of January, they were reporting that they were managing to contact the vast majority of people. So now that things have gone down, we're aware that there is capacity there. So I'm kind of a wee bit the same as yourself, that we've been keeping a regular eye on the Public Health Scotland thing on localities, and there doesn't seem to be, and even from discussions with the Health Board, there doesn't seem to be any single pattern. So we're not seeing one locality in Inverclyde that is consistently worse than anywhere else. So we can get it down to intermediate zones, and there's no obvious pattern to it. There's nowhere that you can say we clearly have an issue in, just for sake of argument, somewhere like Larkfield. There's nothing like that says here there's a problem that's consistent and has lasted a long time. And I suppose that's one of the things that's made it harder for us to plan the likes of asymptomatic testing, because we don't have anything obvious that says here's where you'd target it. So no, I mean, I'm afraid at the moment we're really not any the wiser, and it could well be that the downward trend starts again tomorrow and continues on back downward, and it may just be a statistical blip. But it's interesting that the same thing is happening in Western Berkshire, East Renfrewshire, that they've all done more or less the same thing in the last 3 or 4 days.
Okay, thank you, Martin. But I suppose that's quite worrying, but thanks.
Okay. I'm going to bring David in when we get to section 8 on your specific question, David, so I'll not forget about you. Joe Crowther, you've indicated general questions. You want to come in now?
That's okay. If I could come in then, Stephen, thank you. The first one may actually come under 12, under event planning. It's basically just to ask.
Can we leave it to then, John?
Okay, can do, yes. Can do.
Right, okay. Right, Channel, you want to come in 4.1?
Yep, just a comment on it. It's regarding making sure that the people who are operating all the shops and, well, open up and can open up, have got their staff seriously trained, and it's got to be understood it's their livelihood, it's their life, and it's the people that come through the door, because half the people now are desperate to get back out again and forget about things, and we've seen that in various places. But we've got to turn around and make sure how, and I know Martin's tied up, but the owners in the shops have got to look at it as well, and that means other hygiene things have got to be in place, because that's the only way we'll beat it. And I keep saying we've got to work together, and we're limited to the staff that we've got who can go and check everybody, But if we here in, we've got to make sure their staff get the information. You have got to be cleaned and use everything you can to protect yourself as well as your customers. And I think that's the biggest one. As soon as we get a letdown, you're out. And what they do, hug each other, drink together, 2 metres disappear. The 2 metres is 2 inches if they're sitting next to each other and they don't care about anybody else but themselves at that time. And they don't realise, they might not catch it, but they can take it home. And I know people elsewhere that's happened to. And that's a sad part. So it's a sad thing, but we've got to work on this. You're right, convener, and we don't know when we're going to get clear it, but we've got to work to make sure we do.
Okay, thanks for that comment, Shanna. Take it as a comment. Okay, moving on to section 5, organisational resilience. Anybody get any questions? We don't tend to ever get questions on this section. No, don't see any. Okay, workforce issues, section 6. I've got a question from Chris Cully on 6.4. Chris?
Thanks, Stephen. It's just really about the table, and I note that a lot of the absence rates have been remarkably consistent since July, but there's now been an increase in the home care, it's doubled. It's in 1 month, and also similarly in facilities management. Is this related to the fact there's now more direct contact with people in relation to COVID? They're becoming more direct contact, or is there other things that's going on in between? I.e., is it workplace? Is it related to the workplace? What do you call it, transmission of COVID, or is there something else happening here?
Okay, bring in Stephen McNabb on that one.
Yeah, thanks, convener. Thank you, Councillor Curley. There has obviously been an increase in absence levels over the last 4-week period, basically. That is really down to, obviously, we've moved into Tier 4 and the government advice around shielding employees. We've got a large number of our employees that are in the shielding bracket. So that has contributed to the increase in those that are not able to attend work. We're also now beginning to see an increase in testing across the workforce, particularly just being reintroduced into the home care side of things as well. And obviously, the more testing, the more potential you discover positive tests, and then the more potential for other staff to have to self-isolate. And essentially, that is the real reasons for the steady increase in absence levels over the last 3 to 4 weeks. But we're obviously continuing to monitor them very closely. But that's really the key reasons, if that answers your question, Councillor Curley. Thanks.
Okay, you okay with that, Chris?
Thank you. So it's a combination of the test and protect, catching people, and also the fact there's more self-isolation just for general protection of our staff.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I don't see any other questions on section 6. So if we go into section 7, Elizabeth, you've got a question on section 7?
I do. It's really just about the. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about the most recent discretionary grants situation. I suppose it was kind of unfortunate that the Tilly reported that it was open at the point where it is. And I'm just wondering if there's anything to do in terms of the Tilly being a communications partner for us all at this time, just helping them to do things in a more timiest fashion. That's probably a long shot, to be honest, but thought I'd ask. And I suppose the other thing is, if people were contacting us as a council when the discretionary grants had closed or been used, or however we term it, then does that indicate that there is still a significant number of, or there are still a significant number of businesses locally that do need help, would meet the criteria for help, but that we don't have the resource for them? And it's really just to get a sense of where we are in terms of that, and if there's anything that we can do.
Yeah, I'll bring Stuart in a minute, but things have moved on a wee bit, in a sense, since it was closed. So Stuart will explain the up-to-date position.
Through you, convener. When we opened the scheme, we had 71 applications for the discretionary grants fund, of which 26 were ineligible, with a remainder of 45 possibly going through the system. That will account for the majority of the £233,000 which have been allocated in the first phase. Councillor Robertson, you'll be aware that the Finance Minister announced last week that she was doubling the discretionary grant scheme. Unfortunately, to date, we haven't had any confirmation of that, and once we do get that, we will open the scheme again. As to the likely numbers, we're not clear, because you'll appreciate with the level of 71 versus 45 eligible, we are getting a lot of people who aren't eligible for the scheme. And unfortunately, we're having to signpost them to other interventions. We can't forecast how many we'll have once we reopen the scheme, but I wouldn't be surprised if we had full allocation again.
Okay, I mean, George, you want to come in on the sort of Telegraph and how we try to work with the Telegraph in terms of getting the message out there?
Well, the Telegraph has been pretty good in getting information out as quickly as possible. I suppose they were, to be fair to them, I think they were probably caught a wee bit short, since we gave them no indication that the scheme was going to have a closing date, because it didn't at the start. So usually they're pretty sharp in getting information out there. I think they were probably caught a wee bit on the hop. But listen to us is that if there's anything like that, we go onto them right away. Make sure they push the information as much as possible. But it entirely comes down to what they've got in the backlog, and they do have a lot of backlog of content. You can even see that from some of the stories that are taking weeks to get into the paper.
Okay, you want to come back in, Elizabeth?
Yeah, please, if that's okay. Just on the point of the businesses and having a further allocation of funding, I just double check. Did everybody who was eligible at that latest tranche that we have dealt with, did everybody get an allocation, or are there some people who were eligible and didn't get an allocation?
Yeah.
Through you, Convener, Councillor Robertson, of the 45 who are eligible, we have within the funds made available to us full allocation for that. So nobody has not got funds if they're eligible. We haven't put any money out the door because we're still going through the 45 that are potentially eligible.
Okay, thanks, that's helpful, thank you.
I mean, when we come to the next item, I'd like to raise a potential suggestion around how we maybe expand the discretionary support for business. We'll wait to the next item on that. Now, Stuart, the Provost put in the chat a question on sort of single person businesses and what sort of support is available to them.
Through you, Convener, there's a variety of different supports, Provost. I think the last time I checked, there were a total of 52 different interventions available to businesses across Scotland. Single person, primarily newly self-employed hardship fund. The discretionary fund is available for single persons. So what we've got is a whole host of different interventions that are available. And if someone's not eligible for a particular fund, when they come to either myself or Alan's team, then what we tend to do is signpost them to the fund that they are eligible for.
Okay, thanks for that. I don't see any other questions on this section, so move on to section 8. Bring David in. David, you've got a question on the Port Glasgow Vaccination Centre.
Thank you, Convener. It's a question that'll end up being for Martin. Martin, first of all, thank you for all the updates you give us. I know quite a few of my constituents have been quite impressed with the detail I've been able to provide them with in our situation with regard to COVID in Inverclyde. My question now concerns vaccinations. Scotland is now 50% behind England in terms of number of people vaccinated. It's a poor performance. One of the reasons in Scotland is we've tried to distribute the vaccines through the health board. England have done it on a much more decentralised basis and certainly have moved much quicker. It's regarding first of all, the use of the town hall initially. It is not good for public transport. On a day like today, it is quite a long winter walk from the bus station, the bus stops or the train station. And my question is, I presume this is one for the health board, not really you, Martin, but I'd appreciate your answer. Why did they not go Port Glasgow Town or the Gamble and Halls and Inverkip and Kilmacombe? Thank you.
Okay, Martin.
Okay, so I suppose there's a couple of things. One, obviously, I can't really comment on kind of national strategies around about vaccination, but I suppose what I can say is in terms of the selection of sites, we had our first meetings about mass vaccination sites with the health board about mid-January to discuss actually with the intention that this would be up and running for the beginning of February. At that point, the intention had always been to have probably one site in Inverclyde, and that was what they were very much looking at from the perspective of the numbers that they were projecting that they would have vaccine for at that point. So they had a program, they had projected numbers, and they only needed one site in Inverclyde to achieve that. So the CMT had discussed potential vaccination sites prior to Christmas, when it looked like that there might be a faster move to mass vaccination. Subsequently, as you'll be aware, there was obviously a move to, first of all, to get the care homes done properly, and secondly, to start the over 80s through the GPs. So that put this part of the process back a wee bit. But CMT was kind of the view that the town hall, Greenock Town Hall, was the most suitable location. Now, we kept, as you'll see from the log that's attached to this report, Port Glasgow Town Hall was our reserve site. Now, I had expected Port Glasgow Town Hall to be wanted at some point, and I had expected that might be maybe a month or 6 weeks down the line. So it really is it's a kind of very fast ramping up of the programme that we're actually going to have it launching next week. And that only came about in a phone call from the health board yesterday. So it's a very, very rapidly moving picture. With respect to the Gamble halls, I think there were significant issues round about some of the flu delivery in the Gamble halls, particularly to do with the access and egress on the steep slope. And I think that there were quite a number of complaints about that as a venue. And in respect of other venues, for example, KNCC, Inverkip, etc., we are looking at this point in time at venues that can do a certain throughput. And the only ones really we have at the moment are the town halls. Now, it may well be further down the line we have to look at other possibilities, but none of the mass vaccination sites in Greater Glasgow and Clyde have been smaller sites. Actually, Greenock and Port Glasgow Town Hall will be amongst the smallest sites in GGC. A lot of other areas that are using really, really large leisure centres, etc. We are on the smaller end. But they're the largest sites we have.
Kilmacombe Community Centre was obviously used by the GP practices in Kilmacombe for the over 80s, so it's maybe the community halls could be used for sort of smaller scale vaccinations rather than the mass vaccination centres, Mark.
I think that's what we will continue to do, and those will continue to be used because obviously the GP vaccinations that have been delivered thus far will have to have a second round in sort of a few weeks' time. So they will continue to use the likes of KNCC, etc. But in terms of the mass vaccination, it's very much larger sites that the health board is looking at, and they are kind of in control of the requirements. We're just kind of delivering the venues as far as we can.
Okay. David, do you want to come back in? Are you fine with that?
No, thanks for Martin. I would trust the CMT to progress with this rather than the health board, because the health boards are, well, we saw at the briefing we got on the IRH, it was a very, very poor performance by the health board management. And I'd much rather trust our management to organise mass vaccinations in Inverclyde. Thank you, Martin.
Okay, we'll note those comments. Okay, Chris, Tully, you want to come in 8.2?
Yeah, it might not be one that anybody will be able to answer, but I've also, from personal experience, noticed how successful the vaccination programme has been, working with people getting a phone call and then being able to go the next day. But my concern was that if the primary means of communicating with people is by phone call, how has this been chased up? We don't get anybody getting in contact, if not able to get in contact. So just to try and see, is there any door knocking going on and things like that? If anybody can give us a wee bit of steer about that.
Martin?
Apologies, somebody tried to phone me just as the question was being asked, so, so I'm afraid I missed it and trying to find it, hang up.
Chris was just asking if the primary means of contacting people by phone and they're not getting an answer, is there any follow-up? Is there any plans to knock on doors of people?
So there's two different systems. I think the primary means of contact through the GP appointments. So that is for the over 80s, the over 75s, and the clinically extremely vulnerable. The bulk of those are being delivered by the GPs, and they are doing it by phone, and that's something that's entirely being delivered by them. So I honestly couldn't answer that. In terms of the mass vaccination for the 70 to 75, and as will be commencing next week, the 65 to 70s group, that's being done by appointment letters rather than by phone.
Okay, Chris, you want to come back in on that?
Okay, I think it's obviously maybe not something that maybe chase up elsewhere then. I've just got a wee bit of a concern that if you're a wee bit hard of hearing, it's a bit difficult to pick up your phone, or you don't make it to your phone to pick it up by the time you find out you've got an appointment. Then it might be missing some of the more vulnerable people. But it's just to see if there's any ways of sort of catching that. But maybe it might be directed best to what they call it, Louise. That one.
Well, bring Sharon's here for Louise. So bring Sharon in.
I'll answer based on what I know, Councillor Curley, and I'll confirm. My understanding is that our colleague Emma Cummins, who is leading on the vaccinations at home for the over 80s and the clinically vulnerable, is also working with primary care colleagues to identify any gaps in the data. In fact, one of the discussions we were having today was about what the arrangements are in place for checking the lists of people who should have been vaccinated and making sure that all of the people who should be there have been vaccinated. So I do think Emma has a role in that, and that I'm absolutely sure that element will be covered. But how it's done, I'm not sure. So I'll find that out and get back through Martin.
Thank you. That's good.
Okay, Councillor Clockerty wants to know when the over 55s are going to be getting their vaccination, Martin. Can you help them with that?
I'm hoping to get mine round about March, Jim.
Okay, right, we'll move on to the next section, testing. Anybody got any questions on testing? Martin, just in terms of, you're talking about the asymptomatic testing, there's obviously, so in the report we're talking about some of the large employers potentially. Is that what we're still talking about, or are we talking about wider community asymptomatic testing?
So from yesterday's meeting, I think there's still interest in using a couple of the larger employers because they'll be able to give us a kind of snapshot longitudinally in time to say, is there prevalence, is what we are seeing in the symptomatic testing borne out by what we're seeing in asymptomatic over a longer period. But there's also now, I think, a desire, certainly on the health board side, to do some wider community asymptomatic testing. And it may well be that we try and combine the two and maybe have a site where we can cover an employer, but also have walk-in. I think the important thing we need to do when we do get to this point, though, is make clear the distinction between symptomatic and asymptomatic. And this was very much will be a programme for people who don't have it. There is plenty of provision through Crawfordsburn and Partlea for those who have symptoms.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Okay, moving on to section 10. Liz, you've got a question on that?
I do, thanks. It's really just under the humanitarian side of things. I'm taking that title at its word. I didn't know really where to bring this up, but it was something that I wanted to to bring up. I've been contacted by a couple of clergy people over the last couple of weeks about our provisions at the crematorium in terms of streaming funerals. And it's really just to see if we are making any changes or if we're planning to do anything in terms of that. We're quite far into this now, we're a year down the line. And again, people I think are getting a bit frustrated that there aren't permanent facilities in place for the live streaming of funerals and things. So I'm just wondering if we do have any plans to address that, because we are quite a time down the line.
Okay, I raised that very matter today with the Chief Executive. I'll bring Scott in to respond to that question.
Thank you, Convener. It was something we investigated in quite a bit of detail in the spring of last year, the spring into the summer. And we looked at a number of crematoriums across the country and how they were dealing with this. We approached to a couple of local contractors to see if they would be prepared to become term contractors to broadcast funerals. And there wasn't any interest in that. The route we eventually chose was to leave it with the undertakers, where the undertakers make arrangements directly with the family, and the family then do it either through the undertakers appointing somebody, or in some cases the family will arrange for somebody to stream it using 4G. It's not a very satisfactory thing, I have to say, but it is the arrangement that seems to be in place in a lot of crematoriums across Scotland still. But it is something that we're investigating just now to see if we can improve it.
Okay, I'm just asking that, I mean, the intention would be that we would have another COVID update report like this to the full council on the 18th of February, since we're not obviously having the fortnightly meetings of the Horse and Resources Exec. So maybe if we could get an update on that particular matter in that report, Scott. Okay with that, Elizabeth? Okay, anybody else want to come in this section? No, don't see any questions. Okay, on to section 11. Again, Elizabeth, you've given me notice of a question in section 11.
I have. So it's about when we visit premises or when we visit businesses, to check how things are in terms of COVID compliance, really. And I know it's a different thing, but just in terms of the commission services that we have through the HSCP, we get a report to HS Health and Social Care Committee that tells us how monitoring visits have gone. And I know that there's sort of just general visits, but there'll be reactive visits when people have indicated that something's happened or that they have concerns about a particular business. And I'm just wondering, what is the route, or is there a route for reporting the sort of monitoring, if you like, of the COVID visits that are taking place within premises or businesses in the community?
Martin?
We're not currently reporting them, but certainly I'm more than happy to look at it, because our guys are out there doing quite a lot of visits. They're doing, some of them are, as you've said, are in relation to complaints. Some of them are just drive-bys. Some of them are kind of programmed. So there is quite a lot of activity. What I can do is I could go away and see what we could pull together, and we can maybe just circulate an update with the weekly data update over the next couple of weeks, if that would be helpful.
It would for me, yeah, because I know I've had a couple of complaints come via me, and I'd like to know what's happened with them. But I don't want to kind of bother people on an individual basis, and I'm just wondering if it's
see if you want an update. If you want an update on an individual complaint, if you just want to come back to me, I'll get a response for you on what's happened in those individual circumstances. I was thinking more in terms of the kind of numbers, etc.
No, I think probably a more systematic response in having something might be quite useful, rather than just on an individual basis, if that is okay.
I mean, I think that would be helpful, both in terms of the weekly dashboard update we get and in this sort of report as well. But I was going to ask you around, you mentioned about the health and safety executive and the fact that they are sort of now looking for your team to do their inspections forms. I've obviously raised cases with you, and it's been a matter. We've reported that to the Health and Safety Executive. So how will that impinge on the capacity of your team if you're carrying out inspections on their behalf, and do you have the capacity to do that?
I think it's probably all relative. So yes, there'll be an additional workload, but our guys have already been into, amongst other places, they've been into the police station, they've been into a couple of engineering works, they've actually been into Ferguson's to give advice. So they are doing it, and will continue to do it. And I suppose that the reason this has changed is you're probably aware that the HSE has historically been very defensive about their enforcement responsibilities lie, and generally doesn't want anybody else in them. I think there's been a kind of recognition that the scale of this and the numbers, that whilst it may be difficult for us, we can do it, whereas they would just be entirely overwhelmed. I think it's safe to say. I mean, the number of inspectors covering the west of Scotland is very small, and that's the issue here.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, before we move on to the next section, I'll bring Sharon in to give us an update on the care home vaccinations. We should get some up-to-date information on that, Sharon.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor McCabe. The data as of this morning is that 97% of our care home residents have received their first vaccine, and our staff vaccines are north of 77%. We just don't have the finalised figure there, with a number of care at home staff sitting just under 80%, and good uptake very good uptake as best we can establish across the eligible categories for the health and social care workforce.
Okay,
pretty much 100% in those categories.
Good stuff. Thanks for that, Sharon. Okay, moving on to section 12, event planning. John, you indicated earlier you've got a question.
That's correct. Basically, it's to do with the cruise ship industry, and we are aware that many of the operators are taking bookings, and that also that the respective governments in the UK have a Four Nations approach. It's really just to find out, has Inverclyde Council been in contact with Peel and the respective governments in respect of the cruise liner industry, bearing in mind that we have the new terminal and the first vessel that calls there? Obviously that would be a major event.
I mean, I'll bring that in a second, but the current situation, as I indicated earlier on, is that the government Scottish government is wanting to quarantine every visitor to Scotland. So I'm not so sure we'll be seeing many cruise ships anytime soon in the Clyde. But Martin, you want to come in on that?
So I think, to be fair, I think we've been kind of resting on that assumption to a certain extent. It's certainly one that we can take up with Peel to find out. They will no doubt have a certain amount of advanced bookings, which they are not expecting to be fulfilled. It's really just a question of at what point it's likely that bookings will be fulfilled. And I think it's certainly the case that when we do get a vessel that comes into the new pier, whether that's this year or next year, it will be a major story.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, again, maybe potentially we could include an update on that in the next report. Okay, any other questions on that section? Maybe I could ask the Chief Executive. You're planning a big event on the 5th of May, Chief Executive. Maybe you could give us a brief update in terms of how your plan is going for that, and potentially give us a more detailed update in the next report. It's obviously, I've seen nationally, trade unions voicing concerns around the proposed election, and I've seen other voices raising concern. I have to say I've got some concerns myself about the safety of holding an election in the middle of a pandemic. You want to come in on that?
Yeah. Well, as the returning officer, currently, I think it would not be easy to run an election as it stands. And the reason why I say that is going to be extremely difficult to mitigate some of the risks. And probably the biggest risk is associated with, and it's not the only one, by the way, that's big, is when people come to polling stations, and if we have numbers of maybe 40 to 50 per hour being processed through the polling stations, we will invariably have queues outside and people will be chatting. I have worries about older people coming along and maybe being put off to come along to vote. So there's a range of issues around that. The whole issue of postal voting and the increase in that and processing that. And then ultimately, there is significant challenges in terms of the count. Jared and I have been having discussions. I've certainly raised it with the Electoral Management Board about the challenges that we will be facing. So it's not without problems, I would have to say. However, we don't know what faces us on the 5th of May in terms of what level we'll be at, how far we'll be on with the vaccinations. And even if they were fully running to plan on the vaccinations, there is no indication at the moment that having a vaccination doesn't stop you as an individual spreading the virus. So many questions to be asked and many questions to be answered. So that's a bit long-winded, convener, but I suppose you get the impression that I see troubled times ahead, and as a team we need to work at it. And I recognise that the unions, and I have a meeting with the local representatives to discuss their concerns, because they have similar concerns, I have to say, and understandable concerns. However, as it stands, it looks like we're moving into a position where we're going to have an election, but there is the scope within the Act to allow it to be postponed or go to all postal voting. I know the electoral registration officers have concerns if it did go to 100% postal vote arrangements, that they would require a delay in the actual election date. So lots of things going on at the minute, and concerns certainly by a number of ROs that I'm aware of that mitigating some of the risks will be a challenge. And the other thing that's certainly in my head is the issue of insurance. And clearly got a duty of care for the staff involved. So I could go on, but I don't want to capture the whole meeting. But those are some initial views, convener.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that's helpful for members to hear those concerns. It might be helpful to just include something in the next report as to where we are sort of nationally in terms of the discussions on that, because I think it is potentially going to be a moving feast over the coming weeks and months. Okay, so one final sweep up. Are there any last questions anybody's got on the report?
Oh, it's okay. Okay.
Okay, so the recommendation is to note basically, but can we also agree that we'll get another report to the council on the 18th of February? Any further updates? I think it's important we keep an oversight of this. Okay. Right, thanks for that. Moving on to item 3, the finance update, and Alan's going to give that.
Thank you, convener, and good afternoon, everyone. This report covers a range of financial matters, and if it's okay, if I can just run through those in a one-er, as it were, and then, convener, I'm more than happy if you want to either break it down into sections or just general questions afterwards.
Okay.
The committee's own budget, the Policy and Resources Committee's own budget, is projecting a £528,000 underspend, with capital on budget for the 3-year period, but showing about £40,000 slippage. So there's nothing of any concern there I would highlight to members. The general fund budget for 2021 is projecting a £736,000 underspend, which is an increase of £267,000 since the September update. And this results in a projected free reserves position of 266,000. Remember, the council took decisions in December on the utilisation of reserves, and that's why, in relative terms, there's not much free reserves available at this point in time. Overall, the capital report, the capital programme reports 29% advancement against revised targets, albeit spend is quite low. So Scott and the team are keeping a very close eye on that. And there's a couple of key projects there to ensure that we get to the level of spend that has been projected. The report also includes an update on COVID costs, which members will note from the report has an unallocated contingency of 1.5 million. And this is after a proposed allocation of a further £2.3 million to Inverclyde Leisure for the period 2020 to 23. So this is a 3-year period. It's what officers asked Inverclyde Leisure to update on. Clearly, it's a very fluid situation, but obviously at the moment, Inverclyde Leisure have very little income coming in. They're getting some support from the furlough scheme, but very little other support directly. And so, understandably, they're looking to the council as their major funders to plug the gap. And the council's putting in applications to the income loss fund, which is run by the Scottish Government, to try and replace some of that lost income. In terms of the budget, obviously things have moved on since I wrote the report. The settlement was announced on the 28th of January. It was better than estimated. At the moment, I reckon we've got a cash growth of about 1.2 million, which equates to round about 0.7%, 0.6%, 0.7% next year. And that means the funding gap that went to the December council has reduced, I would estimate, by around about £2.4 million. There'll be a comprehensive report coming to the 18th of February council on that via the members' budget working group. The draft budget also included extra funding for COVID costs in 21-22. I don't know what the council share of that is, but the national sum was £259 million, and this will impact on reserves and thereafter have a knock-on impact into the recommendations in terms of the capital programme and other matters. One major issue that is still outstanding, which I know is discussed at the COSLA leaders on Friday, is what's termed the fiscal flexibilities. The council is relying on the fiscal flexibilities to be enacted on the basis of the decisions taken in December, but I've developed a fallback if that doesn't come to fruition, but hopefully it will. The parliamentary budget dates have now been set, and the key dates are the stage 2 reading on the 8th of March and the stage 3 reading on the 9th of March, thereafter with approval on the 10th of March. So, convener, with the committee's agreement, I would like to propose that the recommendation in the report that we hold a special council meeting on the 11th of March be changed to the 18th of March to give time, just in case there's any last minute changes to the budget, which has happened occasionally, to be reflected in the report for members to consider, subject to the provost agreement, of course. And finally, the report provides an update on the £1 million anti-poverty funding and indicates that there is unallocated funding. That's largely because some of the decisions that the council took in August and November have now been superseded by the Scottish Government launching similar schemes. So we're using the Scottish Government grant first, and that frees up our resources, and obviously the continuation of the UK furlough scheme as well is impacting on that. And finally, if I could say that since writing this report, 2 delegated powers have been agreed, and Jerry will issue those on Friday to do with use of the anti-poverty fund. One is to increase the payment for pupils in receipt of free school meals. At the moment, members will be aware that there's a payment of £25 a fortnight. what, through delegated powers, the CMT have agreed to is that increases to £30 from the level 4 lockdown, and that is due to obviously the difficulty families will have in shopping around to get the best deal for things. So it gives extra money to the families to help buy food. And the other one, members will be aware, I think the last committee, they allocated up to 120,000 extra to iHeat for heating grants to the over 75s. I'm pleased to say that funding has almost been fully allocated, and what the CMT have agreed is that a further £20,000 be allocated out the hardship fund. So all this funding can be met from government grants and the council's anti-poverty fund, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks. So that feedback. I'll just open it up for questions in general, but I suppose before I do, just to mention that obviously one of the recommendations deals with Inverclyde Leisure, and I know at least Councillor Clockerty and maybe one or two others are on Inverclyde Leisure board. I know there's no general need to indicate an interest, but I'm sure you'll do that for completeness anyway, so if you can just note those interests. Okay, any questions on the report? Chris?
Thank you, Stephen. It's in actual relation to Inverclyde Leisure. I think Alan noted the fluidity of the situation, and obviously it's been a subject to a previous report where the reason for the 2.3 million has come about, and obviously, as you know, there's ongoing discussions about a free school. Sorry, I keep on saying that, free school, a free swimming model. I'm just wondering, when do you think we'll be revisiting the £2.3 million, and also what do you call it? How stuck are we on the £2.3 million with respect to any changes to the perceived budget, based on the fact that the budget that Inverclyde Leisure has prepared has been based on some assumptions. So basically, how often will they be reviewing that with ourselves and identifying any additional money or any reduction in the funds that they reckon is going to be required? And also just on that, I think Alan mentioned the fact that there's hopeful to get some Scottish Government funding with respect to loss of revenue. I presume that would hopefully mean that £2.3 million would then be reduced. We'd be able to get the funding from the Scottish Government.
Okay, Alan.
Thank you. A couple of points raised by Councillor Curley there. The first one is that we meet on a monthly basis with Inverclyde Leisure to have meetings. I would reckon a formal review every 6 months regarding this sum. The reassurance I can give members is that 2.3 million will not be paid over in a sort of a lump sum. It's released when there is open book accounting demonstrated need, and we've got no problem with that with Inverclyde Leisure. They're very transparent in the financial information that they report, and we have officers who attend their board meetings and we get all their board papers. So it'd be a case of effectively us hanging on to it almost like an earmarked reserve and releasing it when there is need. As far as the income scheme is concerned, yes, within the council submission, we included the loss of income for Inverclyde Leisure, along with a lot of other loss of income, whether it's around parking, trade waste, all these sorts of things, planning income included in that. Because of the oversubscription, only about 40 pence in the pound was paid out in the first sweep of that, and that was for 6 months of the year. The Cabinet Secretary announced another £110 million nationally for that as part of the budget. That would take us up to around about £1 in the pound, but for 6 months of the year. I don't think anybody anticipated it would be this hard a lockdown for the spring quarter. So there may be more money coming from the UK budget that will come in consequentials to the Scottish budget, but there is a net impact. But you'll be able to see from Appendix 3, I've built in our initial share of the £90 million in the figures, but I've also built in the 2.3 million for Inverclyde Leisure. So we'll keep it under regular review. Hopefully that answers the questions.
So I suppose the expectation, Alan, is that we will be getting more money through the loss of income scheme. The 2.3 million figures potentially going to rise, as is other lost income directly to the council.
Yes, convener, through you, since preparing this report, and this was based on figures before Christmas, so this was based before the First Minister's announcement on the whenever it was of December, regarding the lockdown, that the funding gap in this year alone has opened up by another 350,000 for Inverclyde Leisure. But at the moment, I'm not asking the committee for any more money because I've said it's an extremely fluid situation, but it does indicate why we do need to keep a contingency in the COVID reserve, which is, you wouldn't expect me to say anything different.
Okay, Ruth's put a comment in the chat there as well about that. Okay, Tommy, you want to come in?
Yes, thank convener. Alan, you mentioned the additional COVID support which was announced in the budget the other day, and I know you don't have the exact figures for that. Could you maybe even give us a best guess based on your past experience?
I would have to say, through you, convener, I never guess. It's always an estimate, even if it is a bit woolly. But yes, I would think if we get 1.5% of the 259 million, you might not be a million miles away there. But what I do not know is if any of this funding is going to be ring-fenced for specific uses. Obviously, there's been announcements around education funding. There may be announcements around other pots of funding, which means our share of it could be less than 1.5%. In some cases, could be more than 1.5%. So I reckon you'd be looking at somewhere of the order of between £3 and £4 million that would be coming in, but I don't know what strings would be attached to that.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Any
Alan.
other questions?
Thanks.
Don't see any other questions. So just turning to the recommendations, in terms of 3.4, the proposal is to change the 11th of March to the 18th of March to give us a wee bit more sort of time to digest the outcome of the UK and Scottish budget. So I'm presuming we're all happy with that. Yep. And 3.5 is around the local furlough scheme. So fortunately, due to what David Wilson would call the generosity of the UK government, we haven't needed to draw on that local furlough scheme at this point in time. And the proposal is to allocate it into any unallocated spend into the anti-poverty fund. But given the pressures that were identified in the previous report around business support, and particularly discretionary business support, I think it would be sensible to give officers a wee bit more flexibility around that funding, that they could potentially draw on that for business support as well. Obviously, if there isn't any requirement for that, the money would go into the anti-poverty fund. If there is, then they obviously can draw upon that. So are we comfortable with that flexibility? Yeah. Chris, you want to come in?
Just for interest, how much are we talking about underspend for respect to the furlough scheme?
So far it's the full amount. Stuart, is that about 200k or something like that?
125.
125. Right. So the discretionary funding we've got from the government is at 230 or something like that, 233. And we're expecting possibly to get as much of that, maybe more, because the way the previous pot of 30 million was cut up, it favoured councils who were in level 4 at that time, and everybody's now in level 4. So I would expect we would get more than that. So potentially we'll be able to increase that to over 500,000. But if we allow Stuart and his team potentially to draw upon that 125,000 if required, then obviously that gives a bit more flexibility. Elizabeth, you want to come in?
Yep, I put that in the chat because I'm having a wee bit of connection problems, but it was just checking that if we are going to do that, no issue with doing it, but would we kind of have our own criteria, a wee separate set of criteria, or would we just be augmenting the pot as per the criteria set out for the national programme?
Well, what we're talking about is augmenting the local discretionary fund.
Yeah, but
that's
obviously but there's businesses that obviously can't apply for that or are not eligible for that. So we understand that there are businesses or people who operate locally as traders or whatever who really can't access any funding at the minute. I'm just wondering if we're going with the criteria that's set for the discretionary fund as is, or if we're using our own money, if we're going to apply any separate criteria for our money.
But the criteria for the discretionary fund was set by us, basically. So officers put a report to committee on that, and we agreed the criteria for that. So what I would expect is those criteria would apply initially, but if officers are finding that the criteria that they've recommended to us is, I suppose, overly restrictive, then I'm happy, and I'm sure you'll be happy with flexibility around that. The key thing is to ensure we support as many businesses as we can to survive this pandemic. So I would expect officers will come back to us if they think they need to adjust the criteria for the scheme, then they can use the appropriate channels to get agreement on that. Okay, so we're content with that. Okay, and we agree all the other recommendations. Good. Okay, that's the end of business. Thank you for your attendance. Have a good day.